Hi all, let's look at the amazing game from round 7 of the Gashimov Memorial between Fabiano Caruana and Wesley So. So Fabiano Caruana rated 2802, Wesley So 2788, so a battle of the titans here. D4 from Fabiano, and Wesley plays into the Nimzo-Indian defense. We have C4 E6, and instead of kind of chickening out with a Queen's engine, we have Knight C3 allowing the pin. So Bishop B4 was played, now Knight F3, and this becomes kind of a delayed Rubinstein variation, E3 now. Often it's played earlier before the Knight F3, but E3 now. And Black played Knight E4 here. Quite often players of Black are not moving this piece again. It's a bit of a violation, I guess, of an opening principle. Bishop B7 is often played, for example, like this, where it's meant to be about equal. Black has a iron grip here on E4, as you can see. A lot of games continue from there. But we have Knight E4 a bit more aggressive looking, putting pressure on C3, but White calmly just plays Queen C2. The Knight is supported, Bishop D3, and now F5. So this is a typical Nimzo-Indian position where Black is using that pin and having that grip on E4 like this, but there might be some downsides of this particular method. If this Knight's kicked later, White could end up with some nice bishops, especially this one is one to watch out for. At the moment it doesn't seem to have many prospects. Black castled, pardon me, White castled now, and Black gave up the dark square bishop. So this is where, is this bishop going to be good later or not? Black castled now, and we're coming out of opening book a lot now with this next move. Usually Knight D2 is played. There's 129 games in line, but with Knight D2, for example, like this, Queen H4, F3, and White's meant to be a little bit, well, okay here at least. But we have a very interesting move instead of Knight D2. In this game, C5, and only about 7 games now, so this is a bit of a novelty move, C5. Black now actually does seem to be in a position to play for a kind of crude looking attack from some perspective. You might consider this a bit crude, play Rook F6 and maybe try and mate White potentially, but this is what is played actually. Rook F6. Is it an entertainment move? Is it really going for an attack here? Well, it's pretty scary actually. White's got to play very carefully here, I believe. So Knight E1 was played here with the idea that the knight can be carefully kicked with F3 soon. Black now took on C5, which does expose that bishop potentially as a loose piece. That could be an important tempo gain for trying to get a positional advantage or a transition to maybe a favourable endgame later. This is something to be aware of, this accepting this kind of pawn sacrifice. There's pressure now on the B file, and also of course the C5 square in general might be a target for White later, so watch out for that C5 square. We have Rook B1 and it immediately drags the Queen away from the attack now, with Queen C8. I think something like Bishop A6 is failing tactically here. I suspect Rook takes B8, for example, looks as though it's winning a piece. Yeah, so it's actually protected with Queen C8. And now we have this kicking move, F3, Knight G5, and now a modest looking move indeed, Bishop E2, and it's basically saying E4 is quite serious now to hit this knight and expand in the center. Black now plays actually C takes D4, and we have C takes D4, and note the C5 square without the B6 pawn. There's this knight maneuver available, which is not often usually available, and that could be very useful for White because there's that loose bishop on b7. So we see now knight c6, and of course e4 has been discouraged here. So we have knight d3 though. That c5 square is playing an important role, funny enough. So that sacrifice with c5 has got very interesting implications here. Knight c5 is a serious issue now to address. So we actually have bishop a6 trying to address it. So there's not many attacking pieces now around white's king at all. And this bishop now is seeing the light of day. Bishop b2 with an immediate idea of d5 hitting the rook. So the rook's just the target. So is black losing a lot of tempos with this rook f6. We have knight e7, d5 hitting the rook moves to h6, d takes e6, and it's a very fine looking bishop. Look at all these dark squares without a counterpart. This is a very, very important piece in the position, one of white's trump cards. You can imagine, tactics on the dark squares or pressure on g7 in particular with a queen and bishop battery are pretty dangerous for black. Knight takes e6, and we have now something which just emphasizes the bishop really. Knight f4, accepting the possibility of double pawns, but getting a better grip on the e5 square and maybe clearing out the e file for pressure. We have knight takes f4 being played now. So e takes f4, and okay, let's take stock here. White is a pawn down, so it's a kind of positional gambit, but a very nice one, because this bishop, just intuitively, it seems very, very powerful on this diagonal. And immediate battery opportunities like queen c3 need to be factored in. Looking at g7, we have bishop takes e2, queen takes e2. The queen's not been left alone for a moment. Rook e6, queen d3. So the queen is threatening potentially to get onto the diagonal. That might be useful. Knight g6, not defending the pawn, in fact undefending the pawn with the last move. What naughtiness is going on here? Well, white actually played g3, just supporting f4. I mean, if queen takes f5, it looks like queen f8, and this is pleasant for black if the queen moves somewhere. Knight takes f4 surely is okay for black. Black's defending things here, and might actually swing the rook in for an attack. So I'm not sure this is particularly good, or even like this. So that's pretty dangerous actually, having a knight on f4. Instead, yeah, we don't have this continuation, and having the queens off doesn't seem very inspiring here. This position without the queens. So Caruana's choice, especially with a rook e2 incoming after g3, Caruana's choice is actually to ignore that pawn on f5. He protects the f4 pawn, and now this is a threat, but it's difficult to do anything about it. The rook can't defend it, the queen can't defend it without dropping d7. So how does black actually defend f5? It seems awkward to just go back, maybe just rook e1. So black actually does his own counter positional pawn sack here with this move rook b8, and actually threatens to double rooks, which would seem quite a significant fact and threat positionally. But white welcomes actually the exchanges. Queen takes f5. The endgame transition here is key. This endgame transition now, after the pairs of rooks are coming off, after bishop d4, basically encouraging the rooks to come off, is interesting. If we have a look at this position now, so white has, white has the queen and bishop versus the queen and knight, but this bishop seems a very powerful piece here. It's also looking just to immediately win a7, which of course create a passed pawn and queen b8 opportunity. So black has to react to that, but also g7 seems sensitive. So these pawns on both sides of the board, on dark squares, seem sensitive. The bishop seems a great piece in this particular position, with the knight kind of restricted out of opportunities for the moment. We have c5. Now the reaction to this is queen b3 check. And if black moves the king, say king h8, there's a powerful move here. I wonder if you can guess it. if I give you 5 seconds, a simple and powerful move, a double attack. Can you see? Queen c3, it will be pinning the pawn, hitting the pawn and hitting g7. It just shows, yeah, these pawns are potentially quite loose to this bishop. So we actually have c4 instead. And now queen b5, not minding, it seems, the adventurous c3. But black played knight e7. If c3 was played here, white can actually pick up this pawn now with check, giving access to the back row. Say the king moves here, then bishop takes. Because of that back row, you know, if takes, then we've got a back row issue. So, yeah, basically, this is getting a bit dangerous now. Knight e7, stopping queen d5. Check, but queen g5 threatening mate in 1, queen f8. Now this nasty looking pin, bishop c5, forcing the king to come to the rescue of the pinned piece, king f7. This can't be good if the king's coming out to play. If there's some downside, queen e5 keeping a blockade, threatening perhaps bishop takes a7. Black's getting overloaded here. This is a very nasty pin, queen e8. And now a quiet move here, just torture, king f2, torture for black, and black gives way now some material. It hasn't got really much to do in this position. His pawns are pretty fixed. Any d5, white can just play bishop takes and then taking here. So we have knight c6, and white forcibly wins a pawn, queen h5 check. So looking to win the queen if the king step back, so g6, but losing the h7 pawn. And now, of course, these pawns are playing a far more important role, potentially, to queening in the future, in future endgame, further endgame simplifications. These pawns are going to be quite dangerous. King e6, queen g7, keeping an eye on this potentially running c pawn. Queen f7, and now further simplification with the queens coming off. But let's take stock here of this position. So white has persistently had the advantage of this bishop emerging out of the opening. The classic trump card in Nimzo-Indian is the dark square bishop. So we have an endgame here, though, with potentially dangerous pawns. Basically, it's only one pawn here versus 4. So if the king can help blockade against these two, these pawns would seem to be triumphant, potentially. King e3, the king is lending a hand in the center if needed. King e6, g4. So already there's a sign, there's a passed h pawn on the way, and the bishop is ideally placed sometimes to help that h pawn, maybe like this route in particular. So we see actually, or this is another route like this. So this h pawn and the bishop here are pretty dangerous. d6, bishop a3, and of course on b2 it's also blockading the c pawn. d5, and now bishop b2, so white is keeping the blockade on black's central passed pawns. Knight b4, hitting a2. White does pay attention to that, he moves that. Check, king d2, knight b4 now. h4, yes, the writing is on the wall, as they say. This h pawn is coming down. Knight d3, bishop blockades with bishop d4, hitting also this pawn. It will be significant to win. So a6, h5, creating passed pawns. G takes, and now this is quite good as well. But why not just f5, keeping all the pawns, keeping the knight away from f4. And now g takes h5. It looks likely that this knight's going to be overloaded now, trying to stop these pawns. It stumbles back. Knight e5. White shouldn't take this. He must keep the pressure. Yeah, the black king can rescue the situation, I think, on taking. Just to show that, bishop takes here. The pawn's not getting to h8 because of king f6. And in fact, if h7 actually loses here, because the king would just drop back, take this pawn, come back to win this pawn, and then the two passed pawns would win. So this position here would just be a complete draw. White has to keep the pawns here and keep the king around to stop these pawns, and black can't do anything. So yeah, bishop takes e5 would just throw things away completely. We have actually king e3. So king e3, just keeping the idea h6 to overload the knight. Knight f7, and after bishop g7, the pawn's going to be dragged down, winning material here. This is a pretty helpless endgame now for black, and Wesley So resigned. So it was a very interesting Nimzo-Indian. I think there was a slight novelty move, the c5 move early on, when knight f d2 was the main move, and it created some interesting positional opportunities, quite unique to this game. That c5 square, this knight actually getting activated to c5, if you remember that maneuver. That pawn sack meant queen c8. It sort of started to question the previous moves, rook f6, that was it a target, if the queen's not getting involved, if the bishop is more of a liability, then white actually emerged with a positional trump card, a long-term positional trump card bishop, as evidenced by this kind of classic endgame, you could say, from that variation, delayed Rubinstein, where white's getting that dark square bishop right from the opening and right until the endgame. It's a major trump card. So an impressive game positionally from Caruana, and he's currently on the live rating lists after the tournament, ranked 3 in the world. So this is a very important key win for him, though, against a fierce rival. Okay, I hope you got something from that. Comments or questions on YouTube. Thanks very much.